Imagine standing in a bustling Mesopotamian marketplace 5,000 years ago. You have an extra basket of grain, but you need sandals. You find a shoemaker, but he doesn't need grain. His granaries are full. He wants dates. It seems like a logical impasse that should have halted the progress of civilization. We are accustomed to believing in the quaint fairy tale of barter, the idea that for centuries people traded cows for axes until they finally thought to mint coins. Yet here is the paradox that shatters this textbook logic. In the history of mankind, there is virtually no evidence that a barter economy ever served as the foundation of a society. People never spent their days chasing one another with sacks of wheat trying to execute a direct swap. In reality, money did not emerge as a replacement for the exchange of goods, but as a way to measure human debt and social hierarchy. We didn't invent currency, we invented the mathematics of trust and control, which later evolved into a tool for the enslavement and liberation of entire empires. Behind the facade of glittering gold bars and crisp banknotes lies a mechanism that was never intended for the convenience of merchants. It was a technology of power. To understand how we ended up in a world of digital zeros and bank accounts, we must return to 3500 BCE, to the Sumerian city-state of Uruk. Here, under the scorching sun of Mesopotamia, the priests of the Eanna temple faced a problem: how to compel thousands of people to work on a collective irrigation system while keeping track of who owed what to whom. They didn't wait for coins to appear. They created virtual money. Every basket of barley brought to the communal granary was recorded in clay. The shek, or high priest, didn't hand money to the peasant. He recorded the peasant's contribution. At that moment, the shekel was born, not as a coin, but as a unit of weight for barley. The world we consider primitive was in fact digital before digits existed. If you were a debtor in Sumer, your life belonged to the temple. Debts were inscribed on clay tablets, and if you could not repay them, you became a debt slave. This is the first crack in the myth of free exchange. Money began not with the joy of a purchase, but with the fear of default. Around 2350 BCE, Uru-Inimgina, the great reformer and king of Lagash, sought to combat this by canceling the debts of the poor and restricting the power of greedy tax collectors. He was the first to realize that if the debt burden becomes unbearable, the state itself will collapse under the weight of its own virtual records. But even his edicts of freedom, amargi, were merely a temporary respite in a global game where value was created out of thin air and administrative leverage. We often think gold has always been valuable because of its luster. But look at Egypt during the Old Kingdom. For pharaohs like Khufu, gold was the flesh of the gods, a sacred metal with no relation to daily purchases. Around 2500 BCE, ordinary Egyptians used the deben, copper ingots or pieces of metal of a specific weight. Yet there is a catch. These ingots rarely changed hands. They served as a mental yardstick for value. A seller would say, "This bowl is worth 10 devens," and the buyer would provide linen and grain of equivalent value. The metal was a ghost, a standard that everyone recognized, but almost no one carried in a wallet. The true revolution occurred when those who needed to feed not loyal peasants, but hungry and angry mercenaries took the stage. Let's travel to 7th century BCE Lydia, in modern-day Turkey. King Gyges, founder of the Mermnad dynasty, possessed vast reserves of electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver washed down from the sands of the Pactolus River. It was here, by the will of rulers, that the concept of the coin as we know it was born. Why then? The answer lies not in trade, but in war. Citizen armies and mercenary units needed to be paid in something compact, recognizable, and, crucially, guaranteed by the state. King Croesus of Lydia, whose name became synonymous with wealth by 550 BCE, perfected this system by separating gold and silver. It was a brilliant trap. The state stamped its seal on a piece of metal, certifying its purity, and thereby monopolized the right to create value. Yet behind this convenience lay a new level of control. If previously your debt was a private matter between you and a neighbor or a temple, the state had now become the intermediary. Coins allowed for the collection of taxes with incredible efficiency. The Roman Republic and later the Empire turned this into a perfect war machine. When Julius Caesar minted his denarii from Gallic gold in the mid-1st century BCE, he wasn't just paying legionnaires. He was creating an economic space where every conquered nation was obligated to accept these discs bearing his profile. Money became the blood of war. A shortage of silver in the mines of Spain led emperors, starting with Nero in 64 CE, to begin debasement, reducing the precious metal content in hopes of deceiving the market. This was history's first large-scale example of state-driven inflation. By the 3rd century CE, the Roman Antoninianus was practically copper, coated in a thin wash of silver that wore off within a week. Soldiers refused to fight for scraps of paper, and the great empire began to crumble, not only under barbarian blows, but due to a loss of faith in a piece of metal. Interestingly, while Rome struggled desperately to save its denarius, on the other side of the world, in China, the Tang dynasty of the 7th and 8th centuries was already experimenting with what seemed like madness to Europeans. Chinese emperors realized that if you have absolute power, you don't need gold. You only need paper and authority. But the path to paper money was paved with weight. In Sichuan province, iron coins were used due to a copper shortage. They were so heavy and of such low value that a decent purchase required paying with literal wagon loads of iron. Merchants began leaving this iron with trusted agents in exchange for receipts called jiaozi. In 1024, the government of Emperor Zhenzong of the Song dynasty quickly realized they could issue these receipts themselves. This was the moment money finally detached itself from physical reality. However, this triumph of mind over matter came at a price. The Chinese were the first to learn the meaning of hyperinflation. When the Mongol invasion led by Kublai Khan in the 13th century demanded colossal expenditures, the printing presses ran at full capacity. Marco Polo, returning to Venice, told incredible tales of how the Great Khan turned the bark of mulberry trees into money that was mandatory to accept under penalty of death. In Europe, they laughed at him. For the knights and bankers of Genoa or Florence, value could only exist in something that could be melted down and sold. They did not yet know that soon the gold and silver of the New World, flooding through Spanish ports after 1492, would wreak such havoc in Europe that old methods of measuring wealth would vanish forever. We think money evolved for our convenience, but in truth, it evolved to serve the appetites of power, which has always wanted to spend more than it truly possessed. When Spanish galleons laden to the brim with silver from Potosi began docking at the ports of Cadiz and Seville in the early 16th century, the world did not yet realize it was facing the first global financial catastrophe. King Charles V, and later his successor Philip II, believed they had found an inexhaustible source of divine grace. The Cerro Rico mountain in modern-day Bolivia yielded so much silver that, according to legend, one could have built a bridge from the Andes to Madrid with it. But gold and silver are not wealth, they are merely measures of scarcity. In 1545, when the largest mines were opened, Europe learned the meaning of the price revolution. A massive influx of metal flooded the market, while the supply of food and clothing remained the same. Prices skyrocketed fourfold, devaluing the savings of the nobility and devastating the living standards of the peasantry. The Spanish crown, possessing all the treasures of the world, managed to declare bankruptcy in 1557, 1575, and 1596. The money that was supposed to make the empire eternal became a poison, eroding it from within. While the Spanish were drowning in their own silver, a completely different mechanic was being born in the mist-shrouded Netherlands of Northern Europe. The inhabitants of Amsterdam realized that if metal was unreliable, one should trade in time and risk. In 1602, the Dutch East India Company, VOC, was established. This was the first instance in history where money transformed into shares, scraps of paper granting the right to a portion of future profits from the spice trade. In 1609, the Bank of Amsterdam opened, introducing the concept of bank money. Merchants no longer needed to haul chests of coins that might be counterfeit or worn down. They transferred figures from one account to another. This was a return to Sumerian traditions, but on the steroids of capitalism. It was here in Amsterdam in the 1630s that the first grand financial bubble in history erupted, tulip mania. In 1637, a single bulb of the rare Semper Augustus tulip could cost as much as a luxury house in the city center. People mortgaged lands and livestock for the illusory value of a flower, until the market collapsed overnight, leaving thousands with nothing but worthless roots. But the true turning point that defined the face of the modern world occurred in England. The end of the 17th century was a time of chaos. The country was exhausted by endless wars with the France of Louis XIV. King William III of Orange was desperately short of funds. Taxes were poorly collected, and the prestige of the monarchy was undermined. In 1694, a Scottish adventurer named William Paterson proposed a scheme that changed everything. He suggested creating a private institution, the Bank of England. The mechanic was daring and formidable. A group of wealthy merchants would lend the government £1.2 million at 8% interest. In exchange, the bank received the right to issue banknotes for the amount of this debt. Consider this paradox. Money was created not from gold, but from national debt. From that moment on, the British pound ceased to be just a piece of silver. It became a government promise to repay a debt, backed by the might of the British Navy. This system of debt as money allowed Britain to win wars it could not otherwise afford. By 1717, Isaac Newton, serving as master of the Royal Mint, effectively established the gold standard by fixing the price of the pound in gold. This created an illusion of stability that lasted for nearly 2 centuries. Yet, while London was building its financial empire, France tried to catch up through dangerous experiments. In 1716, John Law, a Scottish dualist and mathematical genius, arrived in Paris. He convinced the regent, Philippe d'Orléans, that the economy could be revitalized by printing paper money backed not by gold, but by the potential riches of the Louisiana colony in America. Law created the Mississippi Company and began a massive issuance of shares and banknotes. In 1719, all of Paris went mad with the thirst for profit. People sold everything to buy the company's paper. But when real reports from Louisiana revealed that instead of mountains of gold, there were only swamps and crocodiles, the pyramid collapsed. In 1720, John Law fled the country, and for decades, France came to loathe the word bank and paper money, which eventually led to financial paralysis and the Great French Revolution of 1789. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the American colonies were solving the same problem of metal scarcity. In 1775, the Continental Congress began issuing its own money, Continentals, to finance the War of Independence against George III. Lacking gold backing, they devalued so rapidly that it gave rise to the saying, "not worth a Continental." However, it was precisely this failure that taught founding fathers like Alexander Hamilton a harsh truth. Money is a belief in the power of law and the might of a central bank. In 1791, he secured the creation of the first Bank of the United States, laying the foundation for what would later become the dollar. Yet the world still clung to gold like a life preserver. By the mid-19th century, the gold rushes in California, 1848, and Australia, 1851, turned everything upside down once more. Massive flows of metal allowed for the globalization of the economy, linking the exchanges of London, New York, and Paris into a single network. But this stability was merely the calm before the ultimate storm. When the shots rang out in Sarajevo in 1914, beginning World War I, the era of honest money ended instantly. Governments needed not mountains of gold, but mountains of steel and millions of shells. The gold standard was suspended. To pay for the infernal slaughter, empires began printing money on a scale undreamed of even by John Law. Germany, having lost the war and crushed by the reparations of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, plunged into the nightmare of hyperinflation. In 1923, a single loaf of bread in Berlin cost millions and billions of marks. People went shopping with wheelbarrows full of bills, and children built toy houses out of stacks of cash. This was the collapse not just of an economy, but of the very logic of human existence. The faith that a number on a piece of paper meant something was trampled. And it was upon these ruins of trust that a new order began to take shape. One where money finally ceased to be a thing and transformed into pure geopolitical will. The world emerging from the ashes of World War I desperately tried to return to normalcy, but the old magic of gold no longer worked. The crash of 1929 and the subsequent Great Depression finally shattered the belief that the market could regulate itself. In 1933, the new U.S. President, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, took an unprecedented step. He signed the Emergency Banking Act and Executive Order 6102, effectively confiscating gold from the public. Americans were forbidden from owning gold bars and coins under threat of imprisonment. The state bought the metal at $20 per ounce and immediately after the confiscation raised the price to $35. It was either the greatest robbery in history or the greatest salvation, depending on which side of the barricades you stood. But the essence remained the same. The dollar began to devour gold, preparing to become the sole master of the planet. The true redivision of the world took place in July 1944 in the quiet resort town of Bretton Woods. While guns still thundered in Europe, delegates from 44 countries gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel to decide how we would trade after the war. The key players were the great British economist John Maynard Keynes and U.S. Treasury Representative Harry Dexter White. Keynes proposed creating the Bancor, a supranational currency that would not belong to any single country. But America held 70% of the world's gold reserves and possessed the most powerful industry. White won. The Bretton Woods Agreement fixed a new reality. All the world's currencies were pegged to the dollar, and the dollar was pegged to gold. America became the world's pawn shop, and its currency the only bridge to real metal. This was the era of the golden age of capitalism, but a time bomb known as the Triffin dilemma was embedded in its foundation. For the world economy to grow, the U.S. had to print and distribute more and more dollars. But the more dollars there were outside of America, the less real gold backing from Fort Knox. By the late 1960s, the system began to crack. The Vietnam War, initiated by Lyndon B. Johnson, cost colossal sums that America simply printed into existence. French President Charles de Gaulle, shrewd and proud, was the first to sense something was wrong. In 1965, he sent a ship literally stuffed with dollars to New York, demanding they be exchanged for gold at the official rate. Others followed his lead. By 1971, the situation had become critical. U.S. gold reserves were melting away, while the amount of paper in the world exceeded them manifold. On August 15, 1971, Richard Nixon took to the airwaves and performed what went down in history as the Nixon shock. He announced the temporary suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold. This temporary measure lasts to this day. The world woke up in a new reality where money was no longer tied to anything material at all. It became fiat, existing only because the government commanded it. Now, the value of the bill in your wallet depended not on bullion in a bank vault, but on aircraft carriers, inflation rates, and agreements with Arab sheiks. To save the dollar from plunging into the abyss, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger executed a brilliant geopolitical maneuver in 1974. He struck a deal with the Saudi Arabian royal family. The U.S. would provide military protection for the kingdom, and the Saudis would sell oil exclusively for dollars. Thus, the petrodollar was born. Now, every state on the planet, in order to fuel its tanks or run its factories, required American currency. The demand for the dollar became artificial and eternal. We entered an era where money turned into a tool of infinite credit. In the 1980s, under the leadership of Fed Chairman Paul Volcker, America tamed inflation by jacking up interest rates to the sky, which triggered a debt crisis in Latin America, but confirmed a vital truth. Whoever controls the printing press of the most sought-after currency controls the rules of the game. However, this control birthed a monster, a financial sector that grew larger than the real economy. Wall Street bankers learned to turn debts into complex derivative instruments. In the 1990s, Alan Greenspan, who held the post of Fed chairman for nearly 2 decades, believed that financial engineering had made crises impossible. It was an illusion. Money became so abstract that it began to be generated through complex computer algorithms. Virtual trillions swirled in the global ocean of finance, backed by neither a gram of gold nor a drop of oil, only pure mathematical expectations. The climax of this madness arrived in 2008 when the investment bank Lehman Brothers collapsed. The U.S. subprime mortgage crisis showed that the entire global financial pyramid was built on sand. States began quantitative easing, a euphemism for printing money on an astronomical scale to save drowning banks. We found ourselves in a strange limbo. The old rules were destroyed, and the new ones had not yet been written. Trust in central banks wavered, and at that precise moment of silence, in January 2009, an entity under the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto launched the Bitcoin protocol. For the first time in thousands of years, an attempt was made to strip the state of its monopoly on money creation, returning us to the idea of digital gold, but this time without the involvement of kings or priests. We have approached the line beyond which money itself may cease to exist in its familiar form. Today, we live in a world where money has finally turned into ghosts. If you look into your bank account, you won't see gold or copper or even paper. You'll see pixels illuminated by electricity. More than 90% of all global money today exists exclusively as digital records in centralized databases. We have completed a grand cycle. From recording barley on Sumerian clay tablets, we have returned to recording units on silicon chips. But while a priest stood behind a tablet and an emperor behind the coin, who stands behind today's numbers? In 2020, as the pandemic paralyzed the planet, global central banks, led by the Fed under Jerome Powell, embarked on an experiment whose scale few fully realize. Trillions of dollars were injected into the system at literally the touch of a button. It was an attempt to douse a fire with an ocean of liquidity, but it exposed the primary vulnerability of our era. Modern money is not value, it is pure inflationary mechanics. The paradox of the modern age is that the smarter our finances become, the more fragile our position feels. We see China introducing the digital yuan, ECNY, implementing a system where money can have an expiration date or limit your purchases based on a social credit score. This is something even the great Kublai Khan could not achieve: absolute control over every transaction of every subject in real time. On the other hand, we are witnessing the rebellion of algorithms. Bitcoin, whose genesis block was laid in the shadow of the 2008 crisis, has made governments nervous. The attempt by individuals like Jack Dorsey or Elon Musk to legitimize decentralized finance is not just a crypto fad. It is a struggle over who will possess the right to issue trust, the state or a mathematical code. In 2021, El Salvador, under President Nayib Bukele, officially recognized Bitcoin as legal tender, becoming the first laboratory of this new world where the borders of national currencies are beginning to blur.
But while crypto enthusiasts dream of freedom, real power is shifting toward those who manage data flows. We are entering an era that historian Niall Ferguson calls the age of the great financial rift. Money is no longer just a tool of exchange. It has become a weapon in a geopolitical game. In 2022, the disconnection of major banks from the SWIFT system and the freezing of gold and foreign exchange reserves showed that money can vanish with a political click. This has forced countries of the global south, from India to Brazil, to seek alternatives to the dollar, launching de-dollarization processes that could change the world map more profoundly than any war. We are used to thinking the dollar is eternal, much as people once believed in the eternity of the Roman denarius. But history is a graveyard of eternal currencies that fell victim to the excessive ambitions of their creators.
We are frightened by the idea that tomorrow money could become completely digital and transparent, stripping us of our last right to anonymity. But the truth goes even deeper. We are approaching a moment when the very concept of price might disappear. Artificial intelligence and algorithmic trading already perform millions of trades per second that no human manages. We have created a system that has outgrown our understanding. When the flash crash occurred in May 2010 and the Dow Jones Industrial Average plummeted nearly 1,000 points in minutes for no apparent reason, the world first realized money now lives its own life inside machines. We are merely observers in this global casino where the stakes rise every day and the chips become increasingly ephemeral.
So, what is money really? At the beginning of our journey, it was a debt between neighbors. In the middle, it was the glint of gold and the majesty of kings. At the end, it is an electrical pulse in a cloud storage. We have traveled from the reality of things to the reality of promises, and now to the reality of algorithms. The most hidden answer is that money was never what we took it for. It is not pieces of paper or zeros. It is a universal language through which humanity agrees on the value of time itself. And whoever controls this language controls the very fabric of the future.
The final conclusion of our story is both simple and harsh. Money is the greatest hallucination in human history, one we have all agreed to believe in. It only works as long as we believe that tomorrow will come and someone else will accept our faith in exchange for food or warmth. But as soon as trust vanishes, whether due to hyperinflation, war, or a software glitch, the magic evaporates, leaving us face to face with reality. We do not own money. Money owns us, dictating the terms of our survival and development. We invented it to simplify our lives, but in the end, we built a labyrinth from which there is no longer an exit. We are the first civilization whose existence depends entirely on the stability of numbers on a screen. And if this faith ever finally collapses, we will have to learn once again how to trade a basket of grain for a pair of sandals, if, of course, we still remember how to do it by then.